Hi friends, how are you doing? Welcome back to story time. We are continuing to read The Day My Butt Went Psycho. So this is our 12 and older group. So obviously, like I say all the time, anybody is welcome to listen at any time. I hope that you are enjoying the story. I certainly enjoy this story so very much. The last chapter that we read was called Stench Gantor. I finally got to say it right. I'm finally saying that word correctly. But remember that they had dropped into the bog, the brown butt bog grossness, and they were able to get out. But Zach was actually able to defeat Stench Gantor with his dirty, stinky socks. So Eleanor was finally like complimenting him and wasn't calling him an idiot like she had all the time, and even said something about him being just like a regular butt fighter, and so that made him feel really good. And so the last thing that happened when we left the chapter was they were getting ready to sail or float with all of the butts tied together. They made a butt raft, and they were using wind power from all of the butts to get to the volcano, but they were going past the butt sirens. So the very last thing that we had left with was Zach coming under the spell of the butt sirens. Nothing mattered. So he had been given the earplugs and the nose plugs so he couldn't hear their beautiful song or smell their beautiful smell like other butts. These butt sirens smelled a beautiful smell. So like when we're thinking of a siren, if you know anything about mythology, the sirens were the sea creatures that sat on the edges of the cliffs as sailors would sail by, and they would sing beautiful songs, and the sailors would come and then crash into the cliffs because they were just so enamored by the beauty of the sirens. Well, that's what these butt sirens are doing. And so Zach is completely drawn in by them, and nothing matters to them. And they even tried to let him know not to get caught up in that. So here we continue. Chapter 7 is called Poopsies and Giant Blowflies. So the last thing that it said was Zach jumped into the water and started swimming toward those butt sirens. Or so Zach was told later, anyway. He didn't remember jumping. All he remembered was waking up with the smacker sitting on his chest, Eleanor sitting on his legs, and the kisser pinching his nose, pulling his head back, and about to put his mouth on Zach's. "What are you doing?" sputtered Zach, spitting out seawater. The kisser pulled back. "Trying to save your life," he said. "Huh?" said Zach. "You kept jumping in, you idiot," said Eleanor. Zach shook his head. "I did?" "Only 5 times," she said. "You nearly drowned." "I'm sorry," stammered Zach, beginning to feel very stupid. "Sorry if I've been any trouble." "Trouble?" said the smacker. "Trouble? No trouble at all. Feel free to disregard my instructions and risk your life and everybody else's life anytime you feel like it. Why didn't you put your earplugs in like I told you?" "I was going to," said Zach. "But the kicker told me that the siren butts were worth hearing at least once." The kicker glared at Zach. The smacker turned on the kicker. "Is that true?" she said. "Look at that sky," said the kicker. "There's going to be a storm." "Answer the question," said the smacker. "Is that true?" The kicker shuffled uncomfortably under the smacker's glare. "Yes," he said. "It was a test." "A test?" said the smacker. "What sort of test?" "An intelligence test," said the kicker, "which he failed." "He could have been killed," said the smacker. The kicker was looking up at the sky again. "That's one mighty storm blowing our way," he said. Zach looked up. Sure enough, the sky was an enormous black swirling cauldron of storm clouds. big clouds, brutal clouds, the kind of clouds you wouldn't like to meet on a street late at night. "Do you think we'll get there before the storm hits?" said the smacker. "Hard to say," said the kicker. "I think we're only about halfway, and that storm looks mean." As he spoke, the wind gusted violently against their faces, whipping up the swell of almost twice its previous height. Zach watched as the clouds crashed and merged, forming even bigger and more brutal clouds. "Can't we go any faster?" said the kisser. "We could try uncorking the second row as well," said the kicker. "More than that I wouldn't like to risk. The raft could break apart." "It's worth a try," said the smacker. "Eleanor, keep your eye on Zach. Make sure he doesn't try to jump in again." The smacker and the kisser set to uncorking the butts in the second row. While they did that, Eleanor drew Zach aside. "Is it true what you said about the kicker?" she said. "Yes," said Zach. Eleanor shook her head. "I don't know why he would say that," she said. "He knows how dangerous those siren butts are. Unless—" She hesitated. "Unless what?" said Zach. Eleanor looked at Zach and then spoke in a very low voice. "Unless he really did want to kill you." The butt raft rose into the air on a particularly large swell and dropped again, just like Zach's stomach. "But why would he want to kill me?" said Zach, beginning to feel sick again. Eleanor looked around her to make sure nobody was listening and then leaned in close to Zach. "I've had my doubts about him for a while now," she said. "I think he's up to something." "What?" said Zach. "I'm not sure," said Eleanor. "He's been acting strangely, that's all. Like when he sent me to find you in the brown forest, he didn't even offer to come with me." "Maybe he doesn't like me," said Zach. "I think it's more than that," said Eleanor. "I think he's trying to sabotage our mission. I don't think he was expecting either of us to make it out of the brown forest alive." Zach looked at the sky. The clouds seemed to have all joined into one gigantic cloud. Big, black, evil. The wind was getting stronger by the minute, and the sea around the raft was bubbling and churning like a giant washing machine. "He did seem pretty surprised to see us," said Zach, swallowing as hard as he could. "Exactly," said Eleanor. She paused. "I think he might be a butt sympathizer." "No way," said Zach, clutching the side of the raft as it dropped to the bottom of the large wave and rose again almost as quickly. "He hates butts." "So he says," said Eleanor. "A little too often, don't you think? Maybe he just says that to try to cover up the truth, and maybe he's trying to kill you because he's scared that you'll be able to talk your butt out of going through with its plan." Zach struggled to take in what Eleanor was telling him. The kicker, one of the world's greatest butt fighters, a butt sympathizer? It was possible, and yet Zach couldn't deny what Eleanor had seemed to square with the facts. "So, what do you think we should do?" said Zach. "Right now, there's nothing we can do," said Eleanor. "It's going to be difficult to convince the others until we've had some hard evidence. In the meantime, just be careful. He might try again." Eleanor looked around to make sure none of the others were watching. Then she reached down, rolled up her trouser leg, and removed a small butt gun strapped above her left ankle. She passed it to Zach. "Here, take this," she said. "You're probably going to need it more than I do." Zach put the gun in the front pouch of his belt. "Thanks," he said. He hoped he wouldn't have to use it, but it made him feel better knowing it was there. The wind roared and howled. The storm was setting in fast. Zach looked up and saw a large wave, a very large wave. The wall of water seemed to rise forever, and then it started to break. An avalanche of white foam came tumbling down the face of the wave toward the tiny raft. "Hold tight, everybody!" yelled the smacker. Zach flattened himself against the butt raft, wedged his hand in between two of the biggest pairs of cheeks he could find, and braced himself. The waves slammed down on the top of them. Zach had never felt anything like it. He was washed clear of the raft and then sent somersaulting hopelessly into the depths of the butt ocean. Zach was under the water for a long time before he surfaced. When he finally did surface, there was no sign of the butt raft. Just the kicker, the smacker, the kisser, and Eleanor, all fighting for their lives in the foaming craziness around them. "I thought you said that raft was unsinkable," said the kisser as the kicker floated in front of them. "It was," said the kicker. "Then how come it sank?" said the kisser. "It didn't sink," said the kicker. "It broke apart. How was I supposed to know there'd be a freak waves like that?" Zach glanced at Eleanor. She glanced back. She was right, thought Zach. The kicker really was trying to sabotage this mission. Zach gulped. There they were in the middle of the sea of butts. They had no raft. They were going to drown. And if they didn't drown, they'd be killed by the kicker, who was clearly bent on eliminating them all. Zach calmly assessed the situation and then did the one thing possible. He panicked. "We're doomed," he yelled. "We're going to die. We're all going to die." The smacker swam over, grabbed Zach, and slapped his face. "Get a grip, boy," she yelled. "You're not dead yet, are you?" Zach shook his head. "No," he said, but nothing," yelled the smacker above the howling wind. "We're still got a world to save. You can die later if you want, but not now. And that's an order." Zach nodded meekly. He didn't want her to slap him again. Besides, he thought, she was right. They weren't dead yet, and the storm seemed to be easing slightly. There was hope still. That's when Zach saw them. Fins. Triangular-shaped dorsal fins cutting through the water toward them. Zach started to panic again. The smacker was wrong. They were going to die. "Help!" screamed Zach. "Sharks!" The others spun around and saw the rapidly approaching fleet of fins. "Don't worry," said the smacker. "I'll smack them when they come near us, and I'll kick their butts," said the kicker. Everyone looked at the kisser, who stared back blankly. "Well, don't look at me," he said. "I'm not kissing them. Not with those teeth." As they watched and held their breath, one of the creatures leaped out of the sea. It rose gracefully on into the air and then dived back into the water. Zach blinked. He didn't know much about the creatures that lived in the sea of butts, but he knew enough to realize that this was obviously not a shark. It looked more like a porpoise, except that its skin was a dimpled, glossy brown rather than the usual gray of a porpoise. "Nobody smack or kick or do anything to them," cried Eleanor. "Why not?" said the smacker. "Because they're not sharks." "Then what are they?" said Zach. Eleanor smiled broadly and stretched out her hand to pat one on its head, and it headed straight for her. "They're poopsies," she cried. "You mean porpoises?" said Zach. "No," she said, patting the large brown creature as it playfully ducked and dived around her. "Poopsies, and they're friendly. Just put your arm around its neck and it'll carry you to shore." "There's no way I'm putting my arm around any poopsies," said Zach, but nobody heard him. They had already each grabbed one and were rocketing off into the distance. One of the remaining poopsies nudged Zach's arm. He pulled away, but then Zach started to feel the water sucking him under again, and he looked up to see another huge wave, even bigger than the wave that had destroyed the butt raft, and it was about to break right on top of him. Zach had no choice. He grabbed the poopsie and barely had time to catch his breath before it shot off down into the water away from the killer wave. The poopsie remerged in the wake of the others, diving effortlessly through the raging sea. After a while, Zach worked up the confidence to get up and sit on the poopsie's back, using its dorsal fin as a handhold. This allowed it to move even faster, and pretty soon he caught up with the others. "Well, look at you go," said Eleanor as Zach pulled up alongside her. "Everyone would think you've been riding these all your life." "Nothing to it, really," said Zach. "Watch this." He lay flat on the poopsie and pushed himself up, brought up his leg, and stood up. He was surfing. Without Zach's leg dragging in the water, the poopsie was able to swim even faster, and pretty soon Zach was ahead of the group. Then, through the angry spray of the storm, Zach saw it. The volcano. It rose dark and black against the twilight, its smoothly sloping sides rising till they were almost parallel at the top. Well, mostly smooth, except for a lumpy outcrop about 3/4 up the way of the left-hand side. The volcano seemed to take up most of the island, a dark, sinister presence in the middle of the dark, sinister sea. Zach lowered himself back down on to a sitting position. He didn't want to be the first one there. No way. As Zach drew closer, two things became noticeable. First, the smell. Ooh. It was like the sewage treatment plants in the world all put together, only worse. 10 million times worse, to be exact. If Zach's nose could have run away, it would have done so right at that moment. The second thing Zach noticed was the ring of black shapes circling the top of the volcano. "What are those things flying around the top?" Zach said to Eleanor. "I'm not sure," she said, "but I don't like the looks of them." As the group neared the beach, the black shapes stopped circling the volcano and started flying down toward them. The eye of the storm was now far behind them, and the howling winds were replaced by the loud buzzing noise. "Oh no," said Eleanor. "My dad used to tell me stories about these, but I always thought he was making them up to scare me." "They sound like blowflies," said Zach. "That's because they are blowflies," said Eleanor. "Giant blowflies, and here they come." "All right, listen up," yelled the smacker. Form an attack circle. Kicker, you go on my right. Kisser, you take the left. Eleanor, go directly behind me." "What about me?" yelled Zach as the others took their positions. "You keep as low as you can," said the smacker. "Leave this to us." Before Zach could argue, he saw one of the giant blowflies heading straight for him, its huge coppery eyes as big as dinner plates and its proboscis as long as thick as an elephant's trunk. That was the last thing Zach saw before the fly vomited. A thick stream of sticky, yellowish green goo splattered all over Zach and his poopsie. Zach's poopsie dived deep down under the water. The water helped to wash most of the disgusting gunk off both of them. They re-emerged about 50 yards away from the B team's attack circle, the air above the fighting force now thick with giant blowflies. Not that the B team seemed particularly worried. Zach marveled at the ruthless efficiency with which they were dispatching the blowflies. The kicker was crouching on the back of his poopsie, his arms folded across his chest. He was kicking with one foot and then the other, and sometimes leaping up into the air and kicking with both feet at once. He looked more like a Russian Cossack dancer than a butt fighter. The smacker's arms were a blur, cutting, dicing, and chopping the flies like helicopter blades. She looked like a human blender making a giant blowfly smoothie. The kisser was expending the least effort of any of them, but with no less deadly for that. He sat on his poopsie, simply plucking the blowflies from the air, kissing them between the eyes, and then dropping them into the water. Eleanor seemed to be using a combination of both hands and feet, kickboxer style. She wasn't killing as many blowflies as any of the B team, but her broad smile suggested that she was enjoying herself. The sea around them was thick and green and in yellow goo, but just when it looked like the B team had the situation under control, a new wave of giant blowflies began to pour out of the volcano, and these blowflies were even bigger, louder, and more plentiful than the first wave. Their situation looked hopeless. No matter how talented or determined the B team was, Zach could see that they were outnumbered. It was only a matter of time before they would all become maggot food. The smacker recognized it too. "Head for the shore," she yelled. "There are too many of them. It's our only chance. Zach, follow us." The B team raced toward the island. Zach did the same. He stood up on his poopsie and surfaced after them. He saw Eleanor turn around. "Get down," she yelled, pointing into the sky above him. Zach looked up, saw the dark, wet end of a blowfly proboscis, and then everything went black. He felt himself being lifted up into the air by his head. Zach had been through some pretty disgusting experiences in these past few days, but this had to be the most disgusting experience of all. It was also the most painful, because at the same time he was being sucked upward into the fly's proboscis, someone was pulling him downward by his legs. He was being pulled from both ends, and it felt like he was going to snap in the middle. This must be how a rubber band feels, thought Zach, just before it breaks. Just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, Zach felt the force pulling on his legs win out, and his head was pulled free of the slimy proboscis that he splashed down into the sea. As Zach came up for air, he saw the kisser reach up and pluck the fly out of the sky. It immediately stopped its angry buzzing and started cooing like a dove, its whole body softening and relaxing as the kisser stroked its wiry tufts of hair that sprouted out from between its eyes. Then the kisser puckered up, kissed the fly in the middle of its forehead, and gently pushed it down into the water and held it under until it stopped kicking. How nice and gentle. Zach was impressed by the kisser's style. Thanks, said Zach. I owe you. Just doing my job, said the kisser, wiping his mouth with his handkerchief. Come on, we'd better get moving. Zach remounted his poopsie, and then he and the kisser followed the rest of the bee team toward the shore, which was barely visible through the black haze of flies. As they reached the beach, the poopsies all stopped and bucked their riders off. Zach didn't want to leave his. Not only was it his only protection against the blowflies, but he'd kind of grown fond of it. His poopsie, however, obviously didn't feel the same way. It bucked him off into the shallows, turned around, and then swam away. Zach put his arms over his head and started running as fast as he could, expecting to be covered in a yellow-green goo and sucked up from another giant blowfly's proboscis at any moment. But it didn't happen. Look, said Eleanor, who was beside him. Zach stopped and looked around. There were no blowflies. They were all in a thick clump far out at the sea, chasing the poopsies. It must have been them that they wanted all along, said Zach. Eleanor's eyes were full of tears. Those poopsies risked their lives for us, she said. Zach, Eleanor, and the bee team stood on the beach and watched as they all disappeared, taking the entire pack of giant blowflies with them. The flies must have been breeding inside the volcano, said the smacker. Not surprising, really. The conditions would make an ideal nursery. Zach shuddered at the thought of the size of maggots that would be produced by the gigantic flies that had been attacking them. The thought of a volcano full of them made him break out in a cold sweat. He looked around. They were standing on a narrow strip of beach bordered by thick jungle. The jungle consisted mostly of butt trees, which closely resembled coconut trees, except for the butt tree berries, which, as their name suggested, looked more like butts than coconuts. The jungle was alive with hoots and chattering sounds. As strange as it was, Zach preferred it to the eerie silence of the brown forest. What's making that racket? He said. Feral butts, said Eleanor. Butt jungles like this are full of them. But the most amazing thing about the island was the volcano. It was an awesome sight. It rose up out of the jungle and towered over everything. On top, Zach could see that there was a main crater, and a little way down on one side was another smaller opening. There were shimmering stink waves coming out of both holes. We've got to get that volcano plugged as soon as we can, said the smacker. Judging by the warmth of the ground and the size of those flies, it must be pretty full already. Zach knelt down and felt the ground. The smacker was right. It was very warm. Zach knew from studying volcanoes at school that somewhere deep below a volcano there is usually a huge chamber where the molten rock collects. Only in this case it wasn't molten rock. It was much worse. And it was breaking down, composting, heating up the whole island. How are we going to plug it? Said Zach. It's huge. The smacker nodded. It's not going to be easy, but a couple of nuclear butts should do the trick. One for the top of the volcano and one for the side vent. We just need to collect enough feral butts, bind them together, and then build a catapult to fire them up there. They'll explode and create enough debris to seal up the volcano forever. But the butts will still be inside, said Eleanor. They'll just keep on going until they've got even more power, enough to blow the plugs out and create even more devastation. If you've got a better idea, then let's hear it, said the smacker. I say we go in there and find my dad, said Eleanor. Are you joking, said the smacker. There are too many butts in there. We'll be outnumbered 20-1. But my father could be in there as well, said Eleanor. You don't know that for sure, said the kicker. You don't know for sure that he isn't, said Eleanor. No, said the smacker, but if he was, I know he wouldn't want us going in there for someone on... I know he wouldn't want us going in there on some fool rescue mission. He'd want us to do it my way. No, said Eleanor, her eyes flashing with anger. He'd want us to do it the right way, not put a Band-Aid over the top and hope they go away. He'd want us to deal with the problem and its source. You mean try to talk to my butt, said Zach. I'm sorry, Zach, said Eleanor, but your butt is insane. It has to be terminated. It's the only safe way. But what if it's not just my butt, said Zach. What if the great white butt is involved as well? Then we'll kill it too, said Eleanor. She turned to the group. Don't you see, she pleaded. We've got to get it cornered. We'll never get a better chance to make sure it never pulls this or any other stunts again. So that's what this is about, said the smacker. What do you mean, said Eleanor. Getting even with a great white butt. No, said Eleanor, that's not got nothing to do with it. It's got everything to do with it, said the smacker angrily. Listen to yourself. Listen to what you're proposing. I know what that butt did to you and your father, Eleanor. I know what it took away from both of you, but you're letting emotion cloud your better judgment. I want to be rid of the great white butt as much as you do, but dying won't help us achieve that. Who said anything about dying, said Eleanor. We got this far. If we work as a team, we can make it the rest of the way. Why chicken out now? We only got this far by the grace of God and a fair measure of good luck, said the smacker. But it can't hold out forever. The volcano is too steep, too high, too dangerous. And that's not even taking into account the danger of going inside a volcano full of butts. We plug it, and that's final. There was silence. Zach watched as the kicker stepped forward. I agree with the smacker, he said. I want to kick butts as much as you do, Eleanor, but there's no point in killing ourselves. No, said the kisser. There is no point in killing ourselves, but I don't think that's what Eleanor's proposing. We spent the last 30 years risking our lives fighting butt uprisings all over the planet, and we all know who has been behind every single one of them. Eleanor's right. We don't know for sure that the great white butt is behind this, but it's highly likely that it is. We've got the great white butt cornered. We'll never get a better chance to finish it off once and for all. We're a highly trained butt-fighting outfit. If we can't figure out a way to pool our resources and get ourselves up that volcano, then we're not worthy of the name B-Team. I say we go in. Eleanor was silent. They all looked at Eleanor. Finally, she spoke. Well, Zach, she said, looks like it's a tie. 2-2. I guess that gives you the deciding vote. Zach gulped. He looked at the smacker. She nodded. All right, she said. Let Zach decide. After all, it is his butt in there. Zach didn't know what to do. He didn't want to die any more than anybody else, but he knew that going in would at least give him a chance to talk to his butt and convince it to surrender peacefully. But maybe it was too late for that. Perhaps Eleanor was right. It was time to face facts. His butt was psycho. It was probably would always be psycho. His false butt had given him no trouble at all, and it was self-wiping. He could go back home and live a safe, predictable life, free from the tyranny of a wayward butt. Plugging his butt inside the volcano would be cruel and horrible. He knew that. But so was what it was threatening to do to the whole world, and if it had only itself to blame. Zach had done everything he could. Besides which, he trusted the smacker's judgment. "Well," said Eleanor. "Plug it," he whispered. Eleanor's face turned bright red. She shook her head in disbelief and stormed off down the beach. Zach shrugged at the group and ran after her. "Eleanor," he said, "wait, let me explain." "You don't have to explain anything," she said. "You're an idiot, and that explains everything." "At least I'm not a know-it-all," said Zach, who had enough of Eleanor's superior attitude. Eleanor wheeled around. "I'd rather be a know-it-all than an idiot," she yelled. "Did you happen to notice who else you just voted with? The kicker? The man who tried to kill you? The double agent?" "We don't know that for sure," said Zach. "You said yourself, we have no hard evidence." Eleanor snorted. "You are so thick," she said. "How much more evidence do you need? The fact that he voted not to go into the volcano proves that he's the double agent. He knows I'm right. He knows that plugging the volcano would solve nothing. He's on the butt's side, not ours." Zach had an awful, sinking feeling, like he'd messed up again, big time. He wanted to go back and vote again, but that was too late. "I'm sorry," he said. "So am I," said Eleanor, and she turned and walked away. Zach felt bad about his decision, but he didn't have much time to worry about it. The rest of what was left of the afternoon was taken up with pulling butt tree saplings out of the ground, collecting jungle twine, and trapping butts. By nightfall, they made a butt cage and filled it with 40 feral butts, enough to make at least 2 nuclear butts. Zach watched as the butts bounced off the wall, the floor, the ceiling of their cage, hooting and calling the whole time. The smell was appalling, almost as bad as the smell emanating from the volcano. Near the cage were 2 nuclear butt launchers. They were made out of 2 long, springy butt tree saplings at the edge of the jungle, the tops of which were been bent over until they were almost touching the ground. All that was stopping them from springing back up was a short length of jungle twine. One tree was aimed in the direction of the main volcano shaft, the other at the vent on its side. When the nuclear butts were cradled in the top of the tree and the twine was cut, the trees would spring back up like catapults and hurl the nuclear butts at their respective targets. Zach had to hand it to the B team. They really seemed to know what they were doing. As it grew dark, they sat around the campfire eating roasted butt fruit. That doesn't sound very good. Butt fruit? They tasted slightly like burnt toast, but it was the first real food that they'd had since their rations had disappeared in the tornado, so nobody was complaining. Behind them, the jungle was alive with the calls of the feral butts. Luckily, the smoke from their campfire masked their stink as well as the terrible stench of the volcano. "We'll launch the nuclear butts at the first light tomorrow morning," said the smacker, throwing a handful of butt fruit seeds into the fire and causing sparks to leap high into the black tropical night sky. "I say we do it tonight," said the kicker, spitting butt fruit seeds into the ground in front of him. "Why waste time?" "There's not enough light now," said the smacker. "We wouldn't be able to aim the catapults accurately." Zach looked across the fire at Eleanor. She was sitting there sullenly, not saying a word. She had built the fire, but had made a point of not helping with any of the nuclear butt preparations. She was still furious with Zach and wouldn't even look at him. Zach lay down, stretched out his legs, and looked up at the stars. He tried to pick out the familiar constellations that his grandmother had showed him, the saucepan, the Southern Cross, and the scorpion, but he recognized nothing. The only shape he could make out were butts. Big butts, small butts, Orion's butt, a sky full of butts. Zach wondered if he would ever see his butt again. It was probably too late now, but despite everything it had put him through, he still missed it. The previous 48 hours had taken their toll, though, and before Zach could miss his butt too much, he closed his eyes and he fell asleep. When Zach woke, it was light. The kisser was shaking him roughly by the shoulder. "Wake up, Zach," he said. Have you seen Eleanor?" "Huh?" said Zach. He opened his eyes and looked around. He saw that the campfire was out and the stink of the volcano was back in full force. Then he noticed the feral butt cage. It was empty. The smacker sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Oh no," she said, "and the feral butts had gone too?" They looked at the cage. The door was wide open. The smacker punched the kicker, who was still lying beside the fire, snoring loudly. "Wake up," she said. "We've got a situation." "Eleanor must have let them out," said the kisser. "But why would she do that?" said the smacker. "It doesn't make any sense. She hates butts." "Maybe they tricked her," said the kisser. "All along," said the kicker, who was pulling on his boots. "I knew it. She's a butt sympathizer, and I'm gonna kick her butt." "If you can catch her," said the kisser. "Look, the butt launcher, pointing up toward the main shaft, has been fired. Maybe they used it to send her up into the volcano as a human sacrifice. We have to rescue her." "But Eleanor's a smart kid," said the smacker. "It just doesn't make sense that the butts could trick her. She's the butt hunter's daughter, after all." "She's been under a lot of pressure," said the kisser. "We all have. It's easy to make a small error in judgment." "That is not a small error. That is a major error," said the smacker. "It's not just like her. It could be a trap. We go running in there to save her, and they cream us." "I think you're both wrong," said Zach. "She was pretty upset about the decision not to go into the volcano. I think she's catapulted herself inside and gone to find her father." "Now that sounds more like Eleanor," said the smacker, slamming a fist into her hand out of frustration. "She probably let the feral butts out to give herself more time. She knows it's going to take at least a couple of hours to collect new ones." "But surely we're not going to go ahead with that plan now," said the kisser. "We've got to help her." "I say we collect new butts and proceed as planned," said the kicker angrily. "But you'll kill Eleanor," said Zach. "Better she dies and everybody in the whole world gets rearranged," said the kicker. "She's not stupid. She must have known the risk she was taking." "Maybe," said the kisser quietly, "but Zach's right. We have to go in there." The smacker nodded. "All right," said the kicker, "but don't say I didn't warn you." Eleanor was right about the kicker, thought Zach. He must be a double agent. Not only had he tried to kill Zach in the Sea of Butts, but there he was openly suggesting that they condemn Eleanor to certain death. Zach recalled Eleanor's warning. He was going to have to watch the kicker very carefully. "We're going to need plenty of twine," said the smacker. "We'll have to climb." "Why don't we use the other nuclear butt launcher?" said Zach. "Too much guesswork," said the smacker. "Near enough is good enough for a nuclear butt, but not for you. You could fall short, long, or worst of all, get a hole in one and go straight down into the volcano's main shaft. Nothing to slow you down. Straight into the—" "How do we know Eleanor made it?" Zach said quickly before the smacker could finish. He didn't want to have to imagine such a gruesome fate for anyone, especially not for Eleanor. "We don't," said the smacker, shrugging. "She could be lying injured on the far side of the volcano for all we know, but we won't be much help to her if we end up lying next to her in the same injuries." Zach and the B team were soon hacking their way through the jungle. Zach looked around them. He knew something was different, but couldn't figure out what. Then he realized there were no butt noises. In fact, there were no butts. Not anywhere. "What happened to all the ferals?" he said. "Probably massing in the volcano with the other butts," said the kisser. "Their hour of triumph must be near. They'll probably all want to be part of it." There was something about the way Kisser said "hour of triumph" that sent shivers down Zach's spine. The thought that butts might soon be ruling the world was truly horrifying. Up until now, Zach had clung to the hope that he still might be able to talk some sense into his butt. Now he wasn't so sure. There wasn't much time left, and if Eleanor was right, maybe it wasn't just his butt running the show anyway. After 15 minutes of hacking and slashing, they arrived at the bottom of the volcano. In front of them, it was almost a vertical slab of black rock. "We'll head straight up toward the side vent," said the smacker. "It will take a little longer, but it's not as steep. From there, it will be a short climb to the top, and then we can rappel down into the main vent." The kicker and the kisser both nodded. "But how do we get up?" said Zach. "It's too steep, and there are no handholds." The smacker smiled. "I'll soon fix that," she said, tying a length of twine around her waist. She stepped up to the rock face, jumped up, and smacked it hard. A number of small hairline fractures appeared in the rock. The smacker jumped and smacked it a few more times until the impact caused one of the fractures to grow into a crack big enough for her to wedge her fingers of her right hand into it. She pulled herself up and, still hanging, started smacking the rock above her with her left hand. It was slow going, but it was the only way they had. The kicker followed, making the cracks even bigger by applying an explosive kick to each of them. Zach was next, and the kisser brought up the rear. Crack by crack, Zach fought his way up the volcano. But even with the help of the handhold and the smacker's rope, it was still hard work. They climbed solidly for 2 hours without talking. Some sections of the climb were easier than others, but by the time the side vent came into view, Zach's fingers were raw and bleeding. However, he still had to climb a final vertical slab of rock, more sheer and difficult than anything he had countered so far. The smacker climbed this section by herself, then threw down a length of jungle twine for the kicker to pull himself up with. Then it was Zach's turn, and by the time he made it to the top of the rock, his face was exhausted. The smacker reached down and pulled him up over the ledge. Zach collapsed onto his back, and lay there staring up at the dark, streaming mouth of the side vent, his chest heaving. He noted with relief that from here the top of the volcano was not far, and there was no more vertical climbing, just a steeply graded slope. He could also see the kicker was a few hundred yards up the slope. Zach was studying the kicker closely for any signs of suspicious behavior when he heard screaming coming from below the shelf. He stood up and looked over the edge. He was shocked to see the kisser hanging onto the edge of the rock face by one hand, his legs dangling and kicking over the long drop below. "Don't panic," said the smacker, who was trying to grab the kisser's free arm. "Try to concentrate and give me your hand." She knelt down and extended a powerful arm toward him. Zach couldn't see exactly what had happened next because the smacker was in front of him, blocking his view of the kisser. All he knew was that suddenly the smacker screamed, tumbled forward, and disappeared over the edge. Zach heard her scream. He heard her scream until she fell out of range, and he couldn't hear her anymore. And that's the end of that chapter. Wow, a lot happened in that chapter. They were able to get across the Sea of Butts, and they were able to get up the volcano. And so Eleanor is very suspicious, though, of the kicker, thinking he might be working with the Butts, like he might be a Butt sympathizer, and feels like he's the one who's sabotaging everything, and that the plans for them to stop the Butts from taking over the world are coming from the kicker, so they're watching him. And Eleanor was, did you think she was going to do anything? Did you suspect that Eleanor was going to go like in the middle of the night and take off and let all the feral butts go so that they couldn't have the nuclear butts to explode the volcano? Do you have any idea, any suspicions that she might be up to something in the middle of the night? Obviously, nobody else on the B team or Zach thought anything like that was going to happen. Otherwise, they wouldn't have fallen asleep. And the kicker, if he is a double agent working for the side of the butts, he didn't think anything like that was going to happen. So, I mean, it seems like the kicker could be kind of up to something, but Eleanor seems kind of sneaky and tricky herself. Like, she's the one who's suggesting to Zach that the kicker is the one who is the working for the butts, and then she's the one who sneaks off and does whatever. I don't know. So there's a lot of stuff that had happened in there. And I want to apologize right now. I said porpoises the wrong way the whole time. They're porpoises, like a dolphin is the types of those are porpoises. and I kept saying poopsies. They were supposed to be poopuses, like a porpoise. I can't, just like I had so much trouble with the stench gantor, and I finally got that one right. I said poopsies the whole time when it was supposed to be poopuses. Poop. It was supposed to be like porpoise. I still can't say it right. Poopsies. Poop. Anyway, they were supposed to be like a porpoise swimming in the water. Apologize for saying it wrong. I'll probably continue to say it wrong. But anyway, even as I was reading it, I'm like, that's not right. I'm saying it wrong. I still can't pronounce it quite the right way. Anyway, what do you think is going to be happening? So now all this stuff is going so off the cliff. We've got the kisser and the smacker are like off the edge of this cliff. And so it's just Zach now and the kicker, who Eleanor thinks is working with the butts, and now Zach is left with him. So when we come back again together again, the next chapter is called The Butt-cano. And so we're going to find out what's happening. We don't have many more chapters left in this book. I think we only have like 3 more chapters that are left in this book as we go through it. Yes, so we only have 3 more chapters to find out what's happening in this book. Today's chapter was quite a long chapter, so I hope that you enjoyed it anyway. Interesting now, so kind of like, oh, I'm going to say it. It's a cliff hanger, and they were hanging on the cliff of the volcano, or the Butt-cano, the cliffhanger. Okay. Maybe that was a far stretch. Anyway, I hope I see you guys here again the next time that we read The Day My Butt Went Psycho. I hope that you are enjoying it as much as I am. I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.